Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Path Forward on Financing Sustainable Water Infrastructure. My name is Susie Seidelman. I'm the Environment Program Associate here at the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, and I'm going to be your moderator today. This webinar is brought to you by the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread in Racine, Wisconsin, American Rivers in Washington, D.C., and Ceres in Boston, Massachusetts. We're very excited all of you could join us, so thanks so much for coming today. So today we're releasing a new report that details recommendations. It details recommendations for creating a path for financing sustainable water infrastructure. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but here to tell you all about that are Lynn Broaddus, the Environment Program Director here at the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, Jeff Odefy, Director of Stormwater Programs at American Rivers, Charlene Lurig, Senior Manager of the Insurance Program at Ceres, and Chris Crockett, Deputy Commissioner of Planning and Environmental Services at Philadelphia Water Department. So we'd like to ask you to please hold your questions until the end, because after everyone has given their short presentations, we're going to open the floor for a question and answer period that we're actually hoping is going to run a bit more like a conversation than the standard question and answer session. I'll have a little bit more detail for you on that later on, but for now, I just want to go through a few quick procedural notes. If you haven't already entered your unique audio pin, please do so now. That's what's going to actually allow you to join our conversation after the presentations have been given. So if you look at your screen right now, that top box, the arrow coming off of it, is pointing to where your unique audio pin is located on your webinar dashboard. Also, when you're ready to join the conversation, all you need to do is click that little circular hand raise icon that's also on your webinar dashboard. And the second arrow on the screen shows you exactly where that is. Once you've joined the conversation, we'd like to ask you to please state your question over the phone or through your computer's microphone. But until that point, we're going to keep everybody's lines muted. And we ask that if you actually have the capability to mute your own line, to please do that now. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll have it posted to our website, Facebook, and Twitter pages within the next day or so. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the torch to Lynn Broaddus.
Thank you, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I just want to give you a little bit of background on how we came to this point and to this report, and then I will hand it over for those who are going to focus more on the content. Charting New Waters is the result of about 2 years of discussion and consensus building around what is needed to ensure sustainable management of U.S. waters and to meet the diverse demands and expectations placed on our water that we've come to expect for supporting the economy, well-being, and basic security for our country. An integral part of that process, we asked all participants and engaged organizations to make a commitment toward carrying forward the recommendations that were in Charting New Waters, the document that we released in 2010. And as part of that, the Johnson Foundation made a commitment to continue working forward using our convening powers and our facilities to continue to work on the matters raised in Charting New Waters. Among other things, we committed to use our convening role and to continue working on the broad underpinnings of the financial mechanisms, pricing, subsidies, etc., that were identified as being at the very heart of what can either hold us back from long-term solutions, exacerbate existing problems, or ideally drive us towards sustainable and fair water management in the United States. To do this, we engaged with 2 key collaborators, Ceres and American Rivers, as well as depending on the expert guidance of the Meridian Institute. We held a series of virtual meetings and culminating with a 3-day on-site conference that the output of which you're going to be hearing about today. It was focused on trying to get better understanding around what needs to happen to catalyze these systemic changes in our financial and the financial underpinnings of our water infrastructure. As is typical for a Wingspread meeting, we tried to get a diverse set of perspectives around the table, and in this case that included water and wastewater utilities representing both public and private interests in the investment community, NGO advocates, municipal representatives, and others. And we specifically asked that group to focus on the 2 questions that you see here on the screen. What new financing techniques can communities use to pay for integrated and sustainable infrastructure approaches? And how can we direct private capital toward more sustainable water management projects? And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Odefy, who is the Director of Stormwater Programs at American Rivers. And after Jeff and Charlene and Chris eventually have a chance to talk, we'll talk about where we're going from here and open it up for questions. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff? We had Jeff a minute ago. He's on
I think
there.
I'm here. Am I here?
Okay, great. There you are.
Hi, this is Jeff. Am I here?
Yes, you're there.
Good. A sigh of technological relief. Thanks, Lynn, for the introduction, for setting the stage. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here today. One of the reasons I guess I'd at the outset like to say is that this work is really exciting for me and for all of us at American Rivers because it provides an opportunity for different sectors of the water community to come together. This kind of multi-party collaboration is challenging, it's exciting, it's fundamental to our efforts to solve the challenges that are facing our nation's current and future water infrastructure problems. And we also look forward to it as a vehicle for helping us achieve our goals of reducing the many impacts on lakes, streams, and rivers that connect us. We're been encouraged by the dedication represented at the Wingspread meetings and look forward to continuing the process to really bringing out that underlying commitment to innovation and effective solutions. Now these solutions that we want to talk about today are really at the heart of our conversation, and they're important because they're essential to the way our cities, towns, and ecosystems will adapt to meet current and future challenges. They're going to require that we collectively move towards systems of water planning and management and financing that are more sustainable. And today we'll spend a few minutes talking about what that term means in this specific context. As we envision and start to implement a shift towards sustainable water infrastructure to preserve and work with our water systems, this report offers us first look at some of the challenges facing the various sectors of the water community and challenges that we hope to pose eventual solutions. So I'm going to spend a few minutes suggesting why some of the reasons why sustainable infrastructure and sustainable financing are important for us, introduce some of the elements of this vision suggested by the Wingspread participants, and survey some of the challenges that our water utilities, communities, and ecosystems face as we look towards this transition. So if you want to hit the next slide, I think we're ready to go. We have a lot to cover, so I'll try to move through this smoothly. But I think by now, many of the people on this call are familiar with the overall condition of our water supply, delivery, and treatment infrastructure across the United States. The American Society of Civil Engineers' high-profile rating of our infrastructure gives a letter grade of a D-, really drew attention to the challenges facing many communities, the state of underinvestment and lack of repair in our water infrastructure. It's not really a new problem. Certainly this information was pointed out by EPA decades ago. Back in 2000, or I guess 10 years ago, 2000, they estimated that the deteriorating age and condition of nearly half the water and sewer pipes in the United States would be considered poor, very poor, or life elapsed by 2020. It's one of my favorite categories, life elapsed. 8 years on, or 8 years before that deadline, little has changed to alter that assessment. In many ways, the situation's grown more tenuous. Replacing or repairing this failing infrastructure will place tremendous practical and financial burdens on utilities, ratepayers, and taxpayers. Already, the cost of this fragility is considerable waste and inefficiency, with operating losses and costs that are not sustainable over the long run. Cracks and fissures in our water supply aqueducts and pipelines leak over 6 billion gallons of expensive treated water every day. It's about 14% of our nation's water use. At the same time, water utilities consume enormous amounts of energy to pump, treat, deliver, collect, and clean water. 75 billion kilowatt hours of electricity a year. That's $4 billion costs to local governments. The water withdrawn or consumed by steam electric generation also threatens the health of lakes, rivers, and estuaries around the country. Sadly, and inconveniently, this problem is largely invisible to the public. Right? We have a history of capital construction that's been subsidized by federal dollars. It's left you and I as ratepayers accustomed to low cost and ready supply of water and really disassociated from the financial implications of the service that we require. Because of this public expectation, in many cases, it's been really politically difficult to justify or set water rates to recover the full cost of water. It's a drift that we'll have to, a shortfall that we'll have to address in coming years. On-bill rates are hardly sufficient to cover operational costs, leave capital expenditures to be carried by general revenue bonds. One example, George Hawkins at DC Water likes to talk about the technical challenges of repairing broken water mains that were installed when Abe Lincoln was president, and the financial challenges of funding a 100-year replacement schedule instead of the 300-year schedule he currently faces. All of this is happening at the, in the midst of a funding squeeze at all levels of government. Federal, state, municipal finances are severely strained. The declining availability of federal funds for water infrastructure exacerbates the situation. I guess EPA's analysis a few years back predicted a shortfall of $600 billion between the funding available and the needs we have for rebuilding our water infrastructure. I've heard other sources put this figure closer to $1 trillion. Let's put that in perspective. The cumulative investment made through the Clean Water State Revolving Funds over the past 20 years has been a total of $65 billion. And annual appropriations are shrinking each year. Now, down at the local level, many older cities face a diminishing rate base as population shifts continue. Think of Cleveland and Detroit as just two examples where ratepayers try to support a system that succeeds their needs. The future of expanding demand, stretched and unpredictable supplies, means that finding new ways of paying for water infrastructure will be a prominent topic of conversation for years to come, especially as utilities strive to meet changes brought on in both water supply and water demand, brought on by population growth, competing economic uses, and dramatic changes in precipitation patterns. Nationally, we forecast that by 2040 we may need up to 62% more water to serve growing population and energy demands. Dramatically altered rain and snow patterns threaten the security of water supply, but also threaten infrastructure through increased storm damage. And the ecosystems that we rely on to provide these services are also taking a beating. The watersheds that sustain vital food and environmental webs are under increasing strain. Infrastructure projects that will further deplete or challenge these resources, I'm thinking of a couple of large pipelines that will shift scarce water between western water basins, aren't really ecologically or financially sustainable. And at the same time, we lose large elements of green infrastructure, our natural capital, both due to ever-increasing development and more infrastructure projects. This is important because we can't count on our current infrastructure, nor are we really able to pay for the infrastructure we need. So the dynamic is challenging. A legacy of patchwork financing systems and underinvestment leave us ill-prepared in many communities to face future challenges. Okay, the next slide. So in the face of these conditions, we have a really clear need for water infrastructure that departs from practices we've employed in the past. We need infrastructure that will respond to changing conditions and needs by introducing flexibility and resiliency. We can take some steps in this direction by reducing the planning. Our approaches to planning have been based around presumptions of certainty in both environmental conditions as well as forecasts for demand and supply. The pipes, pumps, and reservoirs that we need to move drinking water and segregated systems that treat wastewater have really been planned around, focused on the kind of the buildable hardware, rigid systems designed and operated based on static assumptions about natural systems. We need to move away from these assumptions and introduce ranges of flexibility and likely outcomes. Responding to financial, environmental, and demographic shifts will favor systems that take advantage of green infrastructure as well as built infrastructure. New York City's investment in an upstate watershed protection to forego the cost of building an incredibly expensive filtration plant is just one great example of that. Philadelphia's drift towards its Green Cities Clean Water program, we'll hear more about that later, is a perfect example, well, an exciting example of a decentralized approach that's scalable to actual needs and challenges and uses resources more efficiently and reduces energy requirements. Green infrastructure in particular, especially in urban areas, reduces strain upon storm and combined sewer systems, helps eliminate combined sewer overflows, and can deliver significant improvements in energy efficiency. In turn, many of these systems provide opportunities to deliver the right water for the right need. Instead of flushing highly treated water down the toilet or using it to water lawns, we might be able to take advantage of gray water, recycled water, and captured water. All of this is going to require different financial mechanisms to provide the type of appropriate investments for sustainable infrastructure. Let's hit the next slide. I need to move through these a little more quickly. Some of the more challenges along the way that we see are the traditional siloed approaches to water management. We don't typically manage water. We manage different categories of water and assign particular uses to them. And this way we lose opportunities for innovation and efficiency by by combining some of these silos. Our funding cycles, our funding sources actually reflect some of these silos, right? Federal bonds, or federal loans and grants, as well as large capital bonds, go to these gray infrastructure centralized projects, and are difficult to fund gray infrastructure. Oh, I'm sorry, green infrastructure. Another aspect of the problem is that regulations haven't really kept pace with needs or emerging possibilities. Public health and environmental regulations create obstacles using gray water, water recycling, or building green infrastructure. The climate change impacts we've talked about before and the loss of functioning ecosystems really add more strain. May I have the next slide? Also in the mix of challenges, this reliance on inflexible demand projections. This slide is interesting. Up in the corner you see some the results of Seattle Utility Commission's attempts to project water demand over the years. They consistently, they relied on modeling that consistently overestimated demand even as population increased and actual demand declined. New York City, another example, 400 million gallons a day of declining need over 20 years. These are on the extreme end, but building this type of ranges and flexibility into capital planning is important. The ability to innovate has also been frustrated by lack of access to capital markets for smaller municipalities. Only about 2,000 of the roughly 52,000 water systems in the U.S. are large enough to issue their own bonds. We need financing tools that can link these smaller systems to private capital or private-public partnerships that can respond to local needs. We've talked about the temporary and declining nature of federal subsidies and the need to adjust to those. And I think in kind of conclusion, we recognize that there are really no silver bullets. There's not one answer that will address this range of challenges. The view is pessimistic, but not bleak. These challenges are surmountable, and I think in addressing them will take a range of creative adjustments and adaptations to our financing mechanisms. We certainly look forward to continuing this conversation and moving forward towards those solutions, and working closely with Wingspread and my colleague Charlene Lurig from Ceres. I'm going to hand this over to you, Charlene, to talk about some of the report's findings and recommendations on financing.
Yep. Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank you to the Johnson Foundation for hosting this webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with Ceres, we are a national nonprofit, and we advocate with and on behalf of institutional investors for corporate practices and policies that allow us to transition to a sustainable global economy. If we can go to the next slide. The Investor Network on Climate Risk is one of the ways that Ceres works. This is a collection of long-term investors totaling about 10 trillion in assets under management. Many of them have fixed liabilities like retirement benefits, and as such they are always in search of real returns that can allow them to smooth out some of the market volatility which we have seen very closely in the past couple of years. And in recent years, as the calls for more investment in water infrastructure that Jeff talked about, the $600 billion needed to replace and rebuild our existing infrastructure has grown louder. Our investors have been hearing from consultants and money managers and others that water is the next big thing. It's the next big investment theme. But surprisingly, there's been very little done here in the U.S. to connect the dialogue between these two conversations, between the systems that are seeking capital and the providers of that capital from the investment community. And I think this report is actually a good first step in brokering that dialogue on what sort of role the investment community can play in laying the next generation of water infrastructure. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about why sustainability is actually a financial imperative. And I'd like to start by reflecting on some of the numbers that we just heard from Jeff. This $600 billion projected need that came from the EPA and the assumptions that are behind that. And as we talk throughout this webinar, I'd encourage people who are listening in to question maybe some of the assumptions that are behind those numbers. Because I think there is an embedded assumption that what we need to do is find enough money to pay for the replacement and rebuilding of the status quo, of the system that we already have in hand. But in reality, the challenge that we face and the ultimate amount of capital that will need to be raised is perhaps of a far different nature. And we have many more challenges before us than simply finding money in the capital markets or otherwise to build the systems that we need. So the problems that you heard from Jeff I'm going to touch on some of them again because they are so fundamental, and they are not just about sustainability. They're about financial sustainability. The two are intertwined and very much mutually dependent. So the way that we've traditionally built and paid for our water systems simply will not continue to work. It's not going to work in a future that's characterized by the resource constraints and the competition that Jeff spoke about. And what this means is that we have to stop thinking about sustainability as a nice thing for water systems to be designed around, but is actually something that's a financial imperative. Traditionally, we've built our water systems through huge infusions of state or federal funding, which have covered the costs of new reservoirs and pipelines. And this kept the marginal cost of water low. And yet, as we built ever outward into suburban developments, as we expanded the size of these systems as they aged, we continued to keep pricing at that same relative level because behaviorally we got used to paying that much. What that meant is that in many places we didn't have the revenue coming in to maintain the system. And the result is what Jeff talked about, the catastrophic events, the major water main breaks, the sewer collapses that make front page news, and then spur a big rate increase to raise the funds to fix the problem. This is reactive planning. And in the end, it ends up costing our ratepayers more than they would otherwise if they planned proactively, all in the service of this short-term affordability goal. In addition to that dynamic, there was something else that was more insidious that's happening in many of these systems, and that was the creeping destruction of the natural systems that supplied the clean filtered water or stored stormwater during a big rainfall event. And while some utilities, like New York City, as Jeff mentioned, were diligent about protecting these natural systems and enjoying the avoided costs that they provided, most systems did not take this whole watershed approach, and the result has either been a decline in water quality over time, or it's been a major increase in operating costs as the energy and the volume burden that these natural systems once provided was transferred to the built systems. So what this means is that our water providers, whether they're providing drinking water, wastewater, stormwater services, are encountering very high and increasing marginal costs to continue maintaining their service. The cost of providing water services is not at all linear in relation to the volume of water that is treated or delivered. So in places like California or Arizona, acquiring another source of water is not going to cost a utility the $400 an acre foot that their first water supplies cost them. It's going to cost them $2,000 an acre foot, $5,000 an acre foot. In some places as much as $15,000 or $20,000 an acre foot. You see a similar dynamic happening in places that are water rich, like Cleveland, in relation to stormwater treatment, where building a storage tunnel to retain that last 1 million gallons of stormwater is going to cost you 5 times as much per gallon as building a tunnel to retain the first 1 million gallons. So at its most fundamental level, approaching these challenges through the traditional centralized systems is just not financially tenable anymore. And top of all of this, as Jeff mentioned, there's the reality that in many places, the debt burden that these systems have leaves very little room to debt finance augmentations of these systems. And so there is no way that we can continue to provide the level of quality expected by customers through debt financing alone. Next slide. Now, the physical way that we've managed water is unsustainable, but the way that we've priced it is unsustainable too, and that's not a coincidence. The two are very much related. In the U.S., the average American household pays about $1 a day for 3/4 a ton of water to be delivered to it. That is an unbelievable number. There's nothing else that you can possibly imagine getting so cheaply except for air. What we are questioning is not affordability of water. Clean water should be affordable to every person, but the volume of water that we consume at that little price cannot be sustained. The good news is that water is essential, but that people are sensitive to the price of water, and that means that pricing can play a really fundamental role here. People will adapt their behavior if the price tells them to. And because about 50 to 70% of the water delivered in the U.S. is used to water lawns and serve other outdoor irrigation purposes, there is a whole lot of room for behavioral adaptation. But because we've gotten used to paying very little for these services, when systems try to adjust their pricing either to recover costs or to drive conservation, they face considerable resistance. And even more perniciously, the water utilities have become so used to seeing their mission as supplying large volumes of water at low cost that they're in search of ever more supply to fuel that historic demand. But that historic demand was only made possible by low pricing. And as supplies become more and more expensive, it simply is not possible to continue to sustain that demand. It's a fool's errand, and it's a very expensive one. And similarly, in many places, the amount of wastewater or stormwater that we as individual property owners contribute to the system has very little bearing on the amount that we pay for that water to be treated. So as a consequence, the systems are overloaded with volume. And the cost of actually building the system to deal with that volume is so great, we cannot afford it, even if it's spread across the entire rate base. And so we have terrible water quality in our urban waterways. We have raw sewage backing up into people's homes in Chicago during rainfall events. We have neighborhoods that are regularly flooding in places like Philadelphia. And all of these events impose costs on someone. So no matter how we finance our water systems, these problems of pricing are ones that we have to address. The next slide. What this all means for water providers is that they will have to transition from the way that they and from the way that their customers have traditionally perceived them, which is as a provider of volumes of water, to a service provider, and one whose revenue stream is not so dependent on the volume of water sold. We actually have to change the way we think of our water systems from being a centralized network of reservoirs and treatment plants and pipelines to a watershed scale system that exists on a mosaic of private and public property. And if we do that, it means that our city streets are part of our water infrastructure because they channel water. And the roofs of our buildings are part of our infrastructure because they can be outfitted to store water for future use or to slow discharge into waterways or sewers. And if we can design water systems that are distributed, we actually expand the range of benefits that our water system can deliver. Now it's providing green space for recreation. It's helping us manage heat events by lowering the ambient air temperature in cities. It's allowing us to actually interact with waterways in ways that bring economic benefit to cities and towns and regions. It not only expands the way that we use that water infrastructure and the benefits that accrue to us from it, but it also expands the pool of capital that's available for managing our water systems, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But ultimately, to pay for all of this, ratepayers have to understand what value they're getting for the payment that they're making, which means that water utilities have to be much more proactive about marketing themselves and marketing the quality of life benefits that the new infrastructure they're putting into place gives us. That's not easy or simple. That is actually revolutionary for water system providers that traditionally have been monopolies. Next slide. Fundamentally, we cannot get away from the basic underpinnings of sustainable water systems, which is sustainable financials. You cannot solicit investment without sustainable financials. And the backbone of that is appropriate pricing. It's pricing that communicates the real cost of delivery, that communicates that water is a limited resource, pricing that's affordable not just for this generation of ratepayers, but for future generations as well. And that's not an easy transition. On the drinking water side, there's significant trepidation that conservation pricing is indeed so effective that the revenue base of the utility will be undermined if it's put into place. And this is a fear that is based in part in reality. But this process of decoupling revenue from volume sold is something that the electric utility industry has done, that they're still in the process of doing and getting right. And it's necessary if we're going to maintain sustainable water supplies and financially secure utilities. And our investors and city councils and public utility commissions need to support this transition. We'll also need to minimize our costs, not by lowering the quality of the services that we provide, but by discovering the inefficiencies that are endemic to the system today. Our water systems, as Jeff spoke about, are huge energy hogs to move and treat water and wastewater. Our distributed systems that provide point-of-use treatment or storage can make us more efficient. Those natural systems that can bear some of the energy and volume burden can make us more efficient. But that's not something that's going to happen on its own. Sometimes water utilities are going to have to work with other stakeholders, and sometimes the sector is going to have more of the spotlight of competition trained on it if we're going to drive better performance that will allow us to capture some of these efficiencies. Can we go to the next slide? So there's no question that all of this takes a lot of work. Some of the work that needs to be done is in the policy arena. Some of it's in the arena of the capital markets or in the governance structures of our water systems. And these three things here are just an example of the sorts of effort that were identified by the set of stakeholders that the Johnson Foundation convened, the water utilities, the NGOs, the financial intermediaries. There are many, many more structural solutions that we identified that are relayed in the report that we're releasing today, but here are just a few. One of them is that we have to transition our accounting standards to reflect the real value of the services that are being provided by the natural assets that we have still available, by the forested land that filters our water, that stores our water. And there are utilities that are working on engaging FASB and GASB around this. We have to be able to educate our public utility commissions and our city councils on what full cost pricing means and why rate setting structures need to be adapted for our systems to be financially and physically sustainable. We also need to find ways of infusing better information, better data into this sector to drive more competition that will lead us to better performance. And there are many ways of doing that through financial disclosures, but also through performance-based rating systems similar to LEED, what LEED did for the building sector for water utilities, that can actually help water managers defend investments in improving the performance of their systems, but also help them understand how they can achieve excellence. So I'll conclude with this next slide, which is the question that's still probably on a lot of your minds, which is, so where is all of the money going to come from? How are we going to pay for this? Well, the good news, as I mentioned, is that if we expand this definition of what our water systems are, we naturally expand the pool of capital that's available to solve these water challenges. So if buildings are part of our water infrastructure, then it means that the dollars that we invest in real estate can be put toward water management in the form of green roofs, in the form of on-site water storage and water treatment systems and the like. And if roads are part of our water systems, it means that city agencies who are responsible for maintaining them can finance that infrastructure in ways that has benefits from a water quality standpoint. You can think of Chicago's Green Alley program, which has been meeting with success in dealing with flooding and water quality issues through the roads department. But a lot of the money that we'll be using to build these systems will continue to come from the municipal bond market, where there can be better signals in terms of the cost of capital that support a transition to sustainable water systems. And there's also a role for private equity and infrastructure funds and public-private partnerships as well to deploy capital to those systems. But there are two caveats no matter what the form of financing is that we take. First, it's imperative that investors understand how the water sector is changing, how risks of supply insecurity and changing demand and emerging technologies that are undermining the role of the monopolistic water utility will reshape sector fundamentals. This is not a risk-free sector. And the sector that we've seen over the past 50 years is not the one that's going to be there in 20 years' time. And second, in the end, with the exception of maybe the work that we finance through real estate investments, no matter what the source is of our upfront financing, the people who ultimately are going to pay for this are the people who have always paid for this. They're the ratepayers and the taxpayers. And that means two things. First, it means that the way that local governments decide to finance this stuff will impose costs on that rate base. And not all modes of financing are equal in terms of the financing costs they incur. That can present challenges of affordability, and we cannot neglect that. But equally important, it means that no matter how we finance it, these investment opportunities are only enabled by a rate base that understands the value of the investments we're making in water systems, and it demands that the rising costs that all of us believe are coming translate into superior, more reliable service. So with that, I would like to hand things back to Lynn. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charlene. This is Lynn Broaddus again, and I just wanted to take a minute, let's see, we need to go back a slide, yes, to say something about, before I turn it over to Chris Crockett, where we're going from here. And as Charlene began to outline some of the recommendations that came from the meeting. And one of the things that we asked for, which is modeling on what we did with the initial Charting New Waters consensus document, was to ask for commitments from each of those who participated in the meeting as to what piece of this they were going to integrate into the work that they were doing moving forward. And there were, depending on what their expertise and their niche was, some chose to continue to work on sustainability standards for water utilities or the accounting standards for that could allow for accounting of alternative assets or natural resources on the books in ways different than we're doing now. Each of these organizations is continuing to work on that, and I'm happy to say that there are a number of entities that were not involved in the meeting but that are working synergistically on some of these issues, such as Earth Economics out of Seattle, and some of the accounting boards and a number of foundations are interested in what they can do to help drive this. Before we open it to Q&A, we want to turn it over to Chris Crockett, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Planning and Environmental Services for the Philadelphia Water Department. Philadelphia is one of those departments that is sort of the one water utility that some folks think is a model of sustainability or allows for a better structure for sustainability. They manage stormwater, wastewater, and water supply. And Chris is going to tell us a little bit about Philadelphia's grand experiment in how to have a distributed and sustainable stormwater infrastructure. Chris, are you able to talk? Is your technology working?
Do you hear me, Lynn?
Yes, excellent.
Okay.
It's yours.
All right, great. Okay, so thank you very much, Lynn, for the introduction. I'm Chris Crockett, and as she mentioned, I'm with the City of Philadelphia Water Department. We're a water, wastewater, and stormwater utility for the 5th largest city in the country, and we're lucky to have the efficiency of all 3 parts of the organization. So next slide, please. When we started looking at stormwater, we started looking at stormwater issues clear back in the 1990s and realizing that we have to start thinking differently about how we address stormwater, that we're just going to have to constantly keep building larger pipes if we deal with it in the pipe it away process. But while we were going through that, we realized from our customers that the way we build for stormwater across the country as water and wastewater utilities, if you did get a bill for stormwater that wasn't through your taxes, if you got it through your utility, it was a surrogate based on the meter. Water meter size was a surrogate. And the surrogate was, if you had a larger water meter, then you probably had a larger property, and therefore you probably generated more runoff, and you should pay more for stormwater. Well, that was a very inexact process. And what we heard from our customers is that this is not really a fair and equitable way of billing. And when you look at it and go through your community, if you realize it, there might be many, many parking lots and other properties that don't have a water meter that aren't paying a bill for stormwater. And what we realized when we went through the process of listening to our customers, that there's about 40,000 people, 40,000 parcels in the city of commercial classification that are not being billed because they didn't have a water meter, but they were generating plenty of stormwater every time it went out there and rained. In fact, sometimes a lot more than some of these properties that paid a lot for stormwater every year. So in the 90s, we convened a Citizens Advisory Council and started talking about how to make this process more equitable. And on the next slide, please. And with that, we came up with a parcel-based billing approach, which many, many cities across the United States are now employing, from Washington, D.C., the whole way over to California. And there's dozens and dozens of cities doing this. And what we looked at in our approach was, from our customer service, customer advisory group, is 80% of the bill is based on your impervious area, 20% of the billing should be attributed to gross area. And we came up with the billable units from that in terms of gross area square feet and revenue in terms of impervious area square footage. And I'll switch over to the next slide and give you an example of a parking lot. This is actually a large car dealership. And you can see in the left corner the gross area is about 600,000 square feet, and the impervious area is about just under 500,000 square feet. Well, under the old monthly charge based on water meter, it was only $377 a month. Now, why was that? Well, it's a car dealership. They probably have 2 bathrooms, a wash-down sink in the garage, and maybe some water so they can wash the cars and vehicles. They may not even wash the cars and vehicles on site. They may take them somewhere else. So by and large, they probably had a very small meter and very small water service. But when you look at this property from the sky, you can see that several acres of pavement generates a lot of runoff. And so under the new parcel-based system, this parcel would see a large charge. Now, implementing this approach we have 2 bookends to this approach. We have our stormwater regulations that make every development in the city manage 1 inch of stormwater, and then we have our stormwater rates. Now, what we realized is the whole goal of charging the proper charge for stormwater is just like with energy, and actually we follow a lot of the energy management conservation models. I'm also our energy plan manager here at the department. And so what we looked at here is how do we work through the process like energy conservation with stormwater conservation. And so what we do now is if you manage that first inch on your property, we actually allow you to get up to nearly 100% credit, 99%. You can get your bill, this property owner with managing the first inch of stormwater can take his bill from $2,500 a month down to $9 a month. That's the lowest charge you'll be able to get. And so that creates a financial incentive. Unfortunately, I think we don't charge enough for the stormwater because sometimes people complain about the payback. And so thinking about the payback of this and how can we incentivize people to retrofit properties that are already here that aren't going to be developed for 20 or 30 or 50 years, how do we get them to incentivize that? So what we actually also offered, in addition to the credits, to improve this payback, we actually rolled out in November a stormwater management incentive program. And with that, we started with a loan program where we offer $5 million in low-interest loans of a fixed 1% rate up to $1 million per project with a minimum 10% equity contribution. And that is one thing, and we've actually had about $1 million worth of loans taken out from us for that. Now, the other thing we just offered last week, and it was just announced to the public, is we offered a grant program. And it's a $5 million grant program available for non-residential properties. And applications are selected based on project cost, efficiency, and effective BMPs are coupled with maximum private equity and financing to get the higher chance of being selected. So, for example, if I have to go back and retrofit stormwater and manage it, it costs me a certain dollar amount. But I know I could possibly get these private owners to develop and manage their stormwater for a fraction of the price I would have to pay for. And that's about efficiency. And maybe we could get some efficiency done here and save some money and actually get more management quicker through private incentives. All right, moving to the next slide. The next slide here should say Arch Street at the top, and it's about 25,000 square feet. And if you compare it to the previous slide, 25,000 square feet compared to 600,000 square feet, you know, you're talking 200 times larger property, or 20 times larger property. So you're talking about a property that's 20 times smaller, but they were paying a stormwater bill that's almost twice the monthly charge under the new system for this large parking lot that we saw previously. And so under this new process, more dense urban properties ended up seeing a relief because they were vertically integrated and they used their stormwater. They didn't generate as much stormwater. And from a planning perspective, if you're thinking about how this works as a tool, this actually is one of those things where, you know, suburban style development that chews up a lot of land that doesn't manage stormwater is actually penalized for that unsustainable practice by using this stormwater approach. I think I'm going to leave you with that idea and these concepts and just remind you that this is just one approach to many approaches that are out there in the country. We're still developing our ideas, and on the horizon, one of the things we have coming up right now is we're looking at trading and banking credits, all kinds of public and private stormwater financing ideas. With this process that we've set up, the benchmarks that we've set up for stormwater requirements for development and for billing, we've actually had a number of innovative people come to us now and say, hey, can I bundle together 100 acres of property and manage it and get a credit? Can I trade that credit to developers? What if I manage more than an inch? What if I get an inch and a half? Do I get extra credit for that? And what we found is that the private community is actually very innovative. When you give them a nice set of rules to play by, they can come up with some very interesting ideas that are more effective and better than anything you'd come up with. And so we're looking forward to moving forward in these innovative financing approaches with the private sector. And with that, I'm going to hand things back to Susie or Lynn, and I'll step off the phone and await any questions.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Those examples really put things into perspective quite nicely. So I want to pause here on this slide for just a few moments to let folks copy down any contact information they might need. And while we're doing so, I just want to run through a few notes on the question and answer session, which we're going to kick off in just a few moments here. So as a reminder, to enter the session, all you need to do is click that little hand raise icon on your webinar dashboard. And if you're one of the folks who muted yourself, please also remember to unmute yourself so that we can hear you. And speaking of unmuting, we're going to unmute about 10 participants at a time. And we're going to do it that way because we really want to allow for a more organic conversation to develop. So we're hoping that this will really allow all the participants to engage with the material and with each other. We're going to see how that goes. We're going to start unmuting folks in just a few moments. But just so that you know what it'll look like when you're ready, when we're ready to have you join the conversation, the little phone or microphone icon on your webinar dashboard right next to your name will change from having a red flash through it to being completely green. So I'm not going to say your name or invite you to speak verbally in any other way. We're just going to go with the whole green icon. So with that, we're going to open up the floor. And I'm going to start unmuting folks now.
And maybe I can ask a question while you're going through the unmuting. This is Lynn again. And you know, one question I had for Charlene and Jess, and maybe Chris, is there have been a number of infrastructure bank proposals on the federal docket, number of organizations looking to do that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how that intersects with the need for financing that drives sustainable water infrastructure.
Sure. This is Charlene. I'm happy to take a first crack at it. This is the proposals that have been coming out mostly of different water associations for an infrastructure bank, or more specifically, there were proposals for an infrastructure bank that could help to leverage federal dollars to bring more private capital into infrastructure kind of across the board. And there was a lot of work being done by water associations to ensure that water infrastructure was eligible for whatever bank would emerge. There's no question that there is a huge need to inject more money into failing infrastructure, whether it's bridges or water. I think the opportunity at hand is to, if that were something that was to move forward, to do it in a way that put in place guidelines that could shape what sort of projects were eligible for that. The concern is that it is easy when there is readily available federal funding to put toward water projects to build the really large water conveyance projects like the State Water Project in California that enabled urban development in Southern California, or the Central Arizona Project, which enabled Arizona to develop, to create high water intensive development in areas that ultimately in the long run, once more improvements, more population came into those areas, created a demand for more water supply. You would already have in place communities who were reliant on very low cost water. Or if you were looking at some of the urban areas that need injections of funding for sewage and stormwater infrastructure, if you were to do that solely through centralized systems that didn't take advantage of any of the sorts of distributed infrastructure that we talked about today, you're only enabling the problem to persist at a subsidized cost. So there's a real need to define how those funds could be used, and it's a real opportunity to inject capital toward a new generation of water infrastructure.
Thanks. Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, or that's sufficient.
Yeah, I think Charlene really captured all of the key points there. Certainly we've been behind, from supporters of some of the infrastructure link bills that are moving forward, or hopefully are moving forward. One thing I think, Charlene, that I would add on to is that we see these also as a vehicle for targeting resources for smaller communities that may otherwise not be able to access some of the existing funding structures. So as the language evolves, that could add an extra incentive or an extra resource for us.
Great, thanks. There are a few of you who have had your hands up or who have submitted questions in writing. I don't know if one of you wants to jump in with a question. Greg Smith, if you are one of those people, and if you have a question, or if you want me to read your question for you, let me read one of his. Greg had a number of questions related to how privatization of water utilities might operate in the long run, such as how will private investment for profit result in changes that publicly supported systems could not make by themselves. Charlene, if you could take that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think there is a real need for the national and regional dialogue to get more specific about what they mean when they talk about the role of private capital in financing these systems, because there are lots of different ways it can happen. And there's great examples of systems, even in Seattle, that are working with private companies to build and operate water treatment plants or other elements of the system like that can actually result in better cost savings for the public system, because it doesn't have to have the human resources on hand or the upfront capital to build it. So there are great ways that it can work. There are also an increasing number of funds out there that are very interested in privatizing or consolidating water resources, whether that is water rights itself, or whether it is taking private or consolidating water utilities that have once been public utilities. There is no question that there is a significant amount of capital that is waiting in the wings to play in the water space in a number of ways. And it can be done in ways that are to the benefit of the rate base. We certainly have a long tradition of investor-owned utilities providing water in the United States, and doing that at high quality and reasonable cost. In order for that to persist, you have to have an empowered public utility commission that is willing to keep the interests of the rate base in mind. And you need to also, I think, have an investment community and the providers of private capital who have an idea of how private capital can come to play responsibly. And that is extremely important from a reputational political risk perspective as well. I'm down here in Austin, Texas, where there's been quite a bit of political response to the privatization of Southwest Water Company and the resulting rate increases for the retail providers that buy water for them. And that is an operating environment that is significant for those providers of private capital. So it's an important role, but it's one that really needs to be very proactive in defining a responsible and sustainable vision.
Thanks, Charlene. This is Lynn. There's some weird sounds coming through, so if you're not speaking, if you could mute your phone. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but that would be very helpful. Melinda Katzen, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
I can barely hear you guys at this point, so if Lynn wants to read my question, that would be fun.
Okay, yeah, Melinda, I'm not seeing your question on the list yet, but I will look harder. I have another question in front of me right now, and I really do hope that people can try muting, because we're getting some echoing from somewhere. How does the use of appropriately treated wastewater fit into this discussion? For instance, wastewater used in a power plant for closed cycle cooling, or I'm going to add on to her question, maybe also water from a wastewater treatment plant that could then be used for other sources. And if any of our speakers would like to address that, that would be great.
This is Jeff. I'll chime in with just a few thoughts. I think the use of recycled water, even though it's problematic in many communities, and there are departments of health and water utilities and local residents who are wrestling with how to best vision a use for that water, can play a really vital role in augmenting supply. I know, thinking in particular about Southern California and some of the regions of that state, where there really is a dynamic of choice between incorporating wider access to recycled water or opting for more energy-intensive and disruptive approaches to like desal plants. And so working out systems, whether they're more community-wide or on-site, for example, for taking advantage of non-potable uses or even eventually potable uses for recycled water, I think will be key.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to read Melinda Cassin's question, and then Stacy will take you next. In the next 40 years, in the last 40 years, excuse me, most investment in wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater has been coupled with EPA funding. The revolving funds are getting smaller. Has there been any discussion about giving such approaches priority for revolving fund money? And I'm guessing American Rivers might want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I think if I understand the question, it's really about how we reallocate or reprioritize the funding that comes through the federally funded revolving funds. And certainly, we kind of a start on this through the ARA-era stimulus bill, where in the infrastructure financing portions, there were 20% set-asides for what were labeled as efficiency or green infrastructure approaches. And there were some criteria that EPA set forth for what those might actually be or what qualifying projects would have to reflect. We've seen, unfortunately, a diminishment in that role. That the current budget only has a 10% set-aside, and only in the clean water state revolving fund portion, not the drinking water side. So I think at American Rivers, our perspective is, hey, that's a really crucial component. We need that set aside to kickstart the program, to really kind of prime some pilot projects, demonstration projects, actual implementation of green infrastructure and efficiency measures that'll start us along this way towards more sustainable infrastructure. I mean, you look at the kind of the history that we're up against of decades and decades of funding centralized hard infrastructure, and making the shift is really going to take some overt policy choices. And we continue to work with EPA and folks on Capitol Hill and in the White House to see that set aside not only continued but expanded.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I don't know if any of our other speakers wanted to weigh in on that. If not, Stacy, let's see if you're unmuted. You could ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, speak up, but you're coming through.
Okay, good. My question, I think, is for Charlene. I was really interested in the suggestion of decoupling how much customers pay with how much water they use. And it's interesting to me because I think my sense is a lot of utilities have pursued increasing block rate structures in recent years that charge customers more the more water they use. So there is a conservation price signal there. So I guess I'm curious about how that works with decoupling, if at all, and I guess also if there's any good examples of water utilities that have gone through decoupling and how water use has changed by those customers.
Yeah, it's a great question. So decoupling is, I guess the most kind of fundamental thing to convey in this is, yes, there are, it is now, I would say, pretty much the norm for water utilities, especially in more arid regions, to have moved toward a pricing structure that, in which you have tiered block rates where the cost of water, the marginal cost of water increases the more water that you consume. And it's been very effective in many places for utilities to be able to reduce the amount of demand that their consumers or customers have through that sort of structure. Now, the challenge is that in some places, they've been so successful in creating a pricing signal that the result has been that their revenue suffers. That's a challenge for water utilities because, for the most part, water systems finance their water treatment plants, the maintenance of their infrastructure, and the rest of it through debt. And so they have fixed debt obligations that are going to be there no matter how much water they sell. The concept of decoupling is creating a mechanism through which utilities can secure the amount of money that they need to service their debt obligations and other fixed costs, no matter how much water their customers are consuming, while also having an effective conservation pricing structure in place so that you're not in a situation of just selling as much water as people are willing to buy because you're trying to make up your revenue stream. And that's a very challenging problem because it's one that is based on the experimentation of the real world and where real money is at stake. If you drop below a certain ratio of revenue to debt obligations, that could end up having an effect on your credit rating, which in turn would have an effect on the cost of capital when you next go to market. So it's a very real challenge. In terms of the utilities that have been doing work on this, I'm not sure that I can give you one or two names of systems that have really done the best work on this, because everybody, I think, is in experimentation mode. I do think there are a number of systems that are in Southern California, in the Irvine area, that have been experimenting with some really interesting rate structures that have enough of a fixed component to make sure they recover their costs. And I'm having a hard time remembering exactly what their name is, but if you now have my contact information, I would invite you to be in touch with me and we can figure out who those folks are. I know that they were working with a consulting firm called Raftelis, R-A-F-T-E-L-I-S, I believe that's right. And we're talking about this at the 2010 AWWA conference. So that's a good place to start.
Great. Thanks, Charlene. The next question is from Alex Gilman, and Chris, it's for you. It says, oops, wait, my screen just moved. What? Can somebody help me find it?
So the question is, so the restructuring of stormwater costs is obviously more equitable and gives incentives for using land more sustainably. But from the two examples you gave, you actually lost revenue. The city building saved more money than you received from the new bill for the parking lot. Overall, has restructuring stormwater costs brought in revenue for other infrastructure projects? And that's for you, Chris.
Chris, could you hear that question?
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So here, I should have emphasized that when we did the restructuring, we're a revenue neutral utility, so we're cost of service based. And so it was a reallocation of charges. So even though I just used those two examples, we have over 100,000 commercial customers, and within the commercial customer class, we reallocated those charges. So though we lost some from some of those center city buildings, there are many more larger properties outside of center city that add up to make up for that revenue loss from the reduction in the bill from that one property. So we haven't seen any revenue reduction. Actually, one of the things that is actually interesting is we added 40,000 customers to our stormwater rate base that weren't there, that weren't paying a stormwater bill until we started charging the people that didn't have water meters for their stormwater. So in essence, though there were some very highly impacted customers which we identified our top 100 impacted customers up front and offered free services to identify ways they could manage their stormwater and save money. By and large, not that many people were impacted that much because we were able to add, another 40,000 potential payers onto the rate base there. And since we're revenue neutral, we can only charge for cost of service, so it doesn't allow us to get ahead to add more money into the infrastructure kitty, so to speak, but it does allow us now more opportunities to get retrofits on private property that would not be happening. the whole reason for stormwater-based billing is to get retrofits on private property. But the other 50% of our stormwater impervious area in the city is in the public right-of-way, and we're still going to have to pay for that, and we're still going to have to manage that, and that's going to be seen in the service charges as well. I hope that answers your question.
That's great, Chris. The next question is from Bob Zimmerman, and I'm guessing this one might be for Charlene, but I'm not sure. One of the big issues with the use of recycled water is liability. Insurers are evidently reluctant to cover recycled water use, and how do we resolve this issue?
Goodness. Well, I'm not sure if I can speak, although I do work with insurance companies, I'm not sure that I know a whole lot about the liability from their perspective, but I would think that for, let's say, building lenders who are looking at a new property that is seeking mortgage financing, and that property might have the ability to treat water on site for potable reuse, which is happening. The Bullitt Foundation is an example. They're building a building out in Seattle that will have that ability. That could be a difficulty when you're working with a lender because of the liability issues. Not that we don't have technology in place that can meet the water quality challenge, but that you might have contingencies. I don't know to what extent that has been the primary obstacle for many of the systems or properties that are looking at putting these sorts of technologies into place. I do know that certainly from a municipal perspective, the idea of treated wastewater, especially for potable purposes, faces huge obstacles just from the yuck factor, which is less about liability, more just about lack of appetite that the public might have. But that certainly changes as well once the water situation gets bad enough. There's a town out here in West Texas that's going to be building a direct potable treatment plant because they are very close to completely running out of water. So I think that those challenges will be overcome when the situation is dire enough in some areas, or where you have real leadership that wants to put in place those technologies and they're willing to work with underwriters to overcome them. I hope that's useful.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. The next question is from John Zeidler, and I'm going to guess that this might go to Jeff, but if others want to weigh in as well, that's great. Great presentation, but it seems to underplay a critical component, the impact of land use decisions on infrastructure needs and funding demand. Can the panelists address the wisdom, or lack thereof, of financing new capacity for low-density development at the expense of maintaining existing systems and utilizing existing capacity? It seems that if we really want to achieve sustainable water infrastructure, both financing terms and pricing should reflect the type of development served. Full service pricing, for example, should reflect distance and density.
Well, thanks, John. Actually, I think John raises some really great points, and I would almost, in the hopes of having the conversation that Susie indicated we'd love to spur today, and invite some other responses and discussion about that. I think when we think about, for example, the infrastructure bank and the prioritization for green infrastructure investments over, expanding sewerage to continue sprawl development, that's exactly, what we have in mind, is prioritizing investments in areas where we're going to both, affect infrastructure efficiencies, but also diminish the overall environmental impact of, infrastructure decisions.
John, we did unmute you. I don't know if you want to say anything, respond back, or if there's anybody else that wants to weigh in on that one. Not to catch you off guard here, but. Sounds like it's going to be hard to hear, John. I'm going to move on to the next question because we do have a number of questions here. This next one is from Morgan Snyder. How does the concept of driving competition among utilities, such as LEED certification, work when in most of all cases utilities are not in direct competition with each other? Can you describe how this competition would incentivize more sustainable infrastructure? That's a great question, and I'm.
So this is Charlene. I'm happy to.
Do you want to take that, Charlene?
I'm happy to take a crack at it, and then if Jeff or Chris or others have thoughts, that would be great. There are a couple of different ways where more of a focus on data and performance can help to drive better practices, even though you're right, most utilities are not in direct competition with each other. One of them is through the capital markets, where in some ways they are in direct competition with each other. There's plenty of capital to go around. So it's not like the city of Portland is not going to be able to finance this year because there's just not enough dollars at hand, but it could translate into a higher cost for them. And financing costs for our debt financed systems are very, very significant. So over time, the ability to drive better information into the marketplace around not only how well utilities fare vis-a-vis energy usage or the amount of water that's being lost through their pipes that's non-revenue water, being able to drive that information to investors, to rating agencies, and be able to authentically make the connection between that and financial strength is a really crucial one, and it's one that can provide a very significant lever for utilities to strive for the very best possible performance. But I think that there's also something at play that could help make something like a lead-based rating system very useful for utilities, not only for managers to understand how they achieve best practice, but also how they go back to their rate base, to their city councils, and to others who determine what sort of investments they can make in those systems by showing just what benefits their approaches to management are. And I think that there is something that's inspiring about being able to say, we are putting a system into place that is among the best in class, and here are the different ways. Here's the way that our energy usage, beats 70% of the rest of the market. Here's the way that by approaching water quality in a certain way, we're reducing chemical load, or whatever it might be. That's something that can help to inspire a vision of the sort of system that people rely upon, but also help them understand how over time the utility is doing things in the right way and in a way that's going to ultimately be of less cost and higher service to them. So I think there's an aspirational component there as well, even though they might not be in direct competition with each other.
That's great. And when I thought about when the lead concept was sort of suggested at the conference, this issue of whether or not there's competition was not raised, but it was my sort of impression that it would drive a sense of pride and a way to communicate with the ratepayers about, because I think ratepayers make a lot of assumptions about what their utility is doing relative to sustainability, and this is a way to communicate with those ratepayers in an easy-to-understand way. Was one of the ways that I was thinking about it. Chris, I'm wondering if you, as someone who works at the forefront of the water utility, might speak to how that sort of rating system would play out for you all.
Well, I guess, when it comes to the rating system and the benchmarking processes, being a utility, benchmarking is a very important way to move the industry forward in many directions. And participating in the water and wastewater side with a lot of research projects, they usually start off with a benchmarking project, and then they disseminate that information throughout the utilities, and then people use that as a way to gain knowledge as to where they stand to make decisions about whether to invest in certain initiatives to improve where they are because they're not best in practice. Nobody wants to be shown on the lower half of practices or in terms of the scoring book. And also, when it comes to your ratepayers, the last thing you want to have is some organization put out a report that says, by the way, here's the 10 worst cities for water quality, or here's the 10 worst cities for infrastructure. And then I think Charlene hit it on the head. When we go to meet with the rating agencies for bonds and go out to the market for bonds, there are certain benchmarks that on our infrastructure management end are used by the bond agency to determine if we're a well-managed organization or not. And I think expanding that information and making sure it's available to the public and available to the ratepayers and available to the rating agencies and available to the politicians is a way of creating an external set of checks and balances and drivers on utilities that, even though they're not in direct competition, is important. And to be honest, we are in direct competition, even though we're surrounded by private utilities. Every time we go out for rates, every time we talk to the public about billing, all of our bills show all the rates for the surrounding areas compared to ours. We always compare our rates to the other 10 largest cities in the country to provide some kind of example of where we stand. We always look at what are our rates going up in the industry faster than the CPI or not. So there are benchmarks out there, and they can all be utilized, and you can use it to get people to adopt. Some are more early adopters, but nobody wants to be on the top 10 worst list, and then at the bottom of the list for practices. And I think just keeping that information out there, and the great thing about the internet is that information gets out there more often, and it keeps the utilities moving forward.
Great, thanks. We have I have about 3 or 4 more questions that I'm going to take. I want to wrap up by the bottom of the hour. But the next question I want to ask is, can any of you give some concrete examples of decentralized water systems? Chris's stormwater is an example of decentralized stormwater utility, but can either of you give an example of a decentralized wastewater or water supply utility? Maybe I'll
I don't have any.
Oh, go ahead,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Okay, I'm not sure it's exactly on point for the question in terms of what a decentralized utility looks like. I think part of the vision is in, as Charlene and Chris and others have pointed out in this conversation, is taking some of the treatment and water management demands and moving them onto private property, right, or moving them out of the explicit control and sole control of the utility. So, for example, I'll point out the Solaire developments in Lower Manhattan, which have on-site wastewater treatment, rainwater capture, water recycling. That all kind of, it takes, I don't want to say completely off the grid, but takes those developments, those structures, and reduces their dependence upon the centralized utility. And that has to be a part of the mix going forward.
Great, thanks. And I know that there are experiments going on, or I shouldn't say experiments, but sort of leading edge trials going on. Bob Zimmerman with Charles River Watershed Association is working with the city of Littleton, Massachusetts on wastewater, decentralized wastewater treatment facility. And I know that Ed Clerico of Natural Systems Utilities, who is working on demonstration projects in a number of places around the country. And so that might be something that we will have to look for other ways to get information out on that. The next question, what role will research and development of advanced water management technologies have on reducing the cost to repair the system and attract private capital investment?
I'd like to take that one. That is great.
Go for it, Chris.
I also run our R&D group, and I feel that research and development technologies are essential to keeping costs down and maintaining costs. For example, for us to replace a sewer or renew a sewer, let's call it, in a street, and we do about 8 miles, 10 miles of that a year, it has costs about $1.2 million a mile to do, 1.4. Now, with the new costs for lining sewers and the technologies, we can actually go in and line a sewer for a fraction of the price that we used to replace it. And we don't have to disturb the whole neighborhood, tear the whole street up, and dig a huge trench and shut down the street for extended periods of time. So not only does that technology save us money, it reduces our customer hassle and the disturbance in the urban network, which ultimately reduces impacts on other utilities, because utilities usually have to get moved or relocated, like water, gas, electric, phone, when we do these kinds of jobs, and relocated, and then streets need to get repaved. So overall, that's a more sustainable approach and allows us to extend the life of an asset, potentially, depending on the technology, another 80, 100 years, and or even longer. And so that's a good example. Lining technologies that are coming out for water pipes, again, another opportunity. And also the research and development technologies, for example, we're moving towards, in our wastewater facilities, towards resource recovery facilities. Theoretically, there's 10 times more energy in wastewater than used to treat it. And so we have technologies that we are in the process of employing to harness that energy out of the wastewater and mine some of the value from it to ultimately make our wastewater plants run off their own energy from the wastewater that's coming to them. And I have a cogeneration project that's under construction doing that now. New technologies like sewer geothermal, we're the first utility in the country. The facility will be running in February to employ sewer geothermal at our facility to heat and cool 20,000 square feet of one of our properties. And then on the green infrastructure end, the R&D developments are phenomenal. New technologies, we have to come up with new technologies that can work in an engineered way to mimic, biomimic nature in a much smaller space, because we've eliminated nature in many urban and suburban environments. So in terms of stormwater treatment technologies really, I think, are at a very early stage. And I think there's with the new rules for MS4 stormwater coming out from EPA and the continued work to reduce combined sewer overflows and address sanitary sewer overflows and defective laterals, I think that's another great area for research and development. And then one of the last areas of research and development that really needs to be developed that the energy companies are leading on, and that is the home energy meters, home water metering, moving to more of an iPhone approach for your meter, so you can see your water use and you can go on and log on and ratchet it back to a vacation setting or anything you want. Being able to have your iPhone get an email from your water meter saying you're using more water than normal, that would be really helpful for people to change behaviors. And I see that happening in the thermostat area with some of the new technologies. So maybe we can go that way with the home water meter approach as well. But I think there's a lot of R&D work to be done in the water and wastewater field, especially if these technologies start becoming competitive with traditional ones. To be honest, I feel like in the water and wastewater industry, we've been working with technologies that have been around since the 50s and 70s, and just recently, in the past 10 years, have new technologies emerged in the market to change the game. And I feel like there's a whole century worth of technologies that we need to develop, because the water and wastewater industry has really not been, from the 70s to late 90s, really hasn't had too many innovations in technology, and it's time to really start seeing that growth. I'd like to see that same growth like the tech sector had in, think of it as going from the large cell phone to the iPhone. I'd like to see the same thing happen for us.
Yeah. And Lynn, I'd like to just add one more thing to build on Chris's point, because I think this is an example of a utility that is excited, understands the power of new technologies and the need to adapt their models to incorporate them and to provide better service through them. I think one of the things that we've seen through talking to rating agencies, to utilities and others, is this entrenched belief that water utilities are monopolies, and because of that, they are immune to any real financial problems going forward. And the sorts of technologies that Chris talked about, and even more so the sorts of technologies that can allow buildings and neighborhoods to create drinking water or even irrigation water on site, demonstrate that this is no longer a monopolistic sector. As soon as you can have the water needs of a building or a neighborhood provided on site and financed and built and managed by someone other than a water utility, it ceases to be a monopoly. And the systems that fail to realize that and continue to invest in old technologies, new, ambitious, very expensive sources of supply that make their water services no longer competitive with these new technologies, or in turn make those new technologies seem very cost competitive in light of their costs, the more that's going to spell some very serious financial problems for them. So we have to take a totally different way of looking at this sector.
And I'm going to echo that. One of the comments that really sparked some interesting conversation during our meeting was the comment that utilities should not think of themselves as a monopoly and should not think of themselves as safe, because many of the bigger users of water and waste are basically going off grid to be able to do their own water supply and their own water treatment. And that's a trend that we need to be cognizant about and build some flexibility around. For the final question, I'm wondering if we can get an answer to Greg Smith's question: how will the new utilities reconcile their stated goal of pursuing sustainability within their statutory responsibility to produce profit for the benefit of their investors? Charlene, you want to take a whack at that?
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why an investor-owned, I'm assuming the question is about investor-owned utilities, but I see no reason why a utility, no matter what its ownership or governance structure, cannot pursue the goals of sustainability in their treatment and delivery and use of water. There to me is nothing fundamental about an investor-owned utility with the goal of creating profit that would not allow them to provide high-quality service to their customers and to preserve and steward water resources responsibly. Now, that may or may not be the overriding or predominant ethic that exists within the sector today. I'll leave that to others to debate, but there's nothing that prevents it from doing that. Any more so than a utility that is working with the goal of keeping water rates affordable would be prevented from sustainably stewarding water resources and providing high quality service. Now, yes, you can pursue affordability to the extent that it leads to you depleting water resources and providing very low quality services, but the objective itself doesn't necessarily dictate that outcome. I do think that we need to have a more sophisticated conversation nationally and at the local level about what sort of role private capital can and should play and what sort of role investor-owned utilities should be playing as well, because there is more and more capital looking to the ways that they can invest in water, not only as a reliable revenue generator from the utility perspective, but also in consolidating water rights. So we have to be able to have that conversation in frank ways and have real expectations around it.
Right. And Charlene,
great.
Chris.
Thank you, Charlene. And I want to thank Charlene, Jeff, and Chris for the work that they've done both throughout this process, but especially in helping us with this webinar today. There was a request that came in during the question period for how participants might be able to get more resources on the types of issues that have been raised today and are raised in the report. And I want to make a sort of unplanned solicitation to the group of you who are on the call, and that is that if you have resources on your organization's website that we could share back out with the group, if you would send that to me at my email address, lbroadus@johnsonfdn.org, with a title something like Water Financing Resources, I will try to consolidate those and send them in an email back out to this webinar's participants. I'm not sure how many of them we can get onto our website, but I can certainly share them back out with the people who are on this call. This webinar will be posted on our website by Friday, and you can link to that by going to our homepage, johnsonfdn.org, and I encourage you to share that with others who were not able to participate in today's call, colleagues or constituents that you work with. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to working with you to see a more sustainable water infrastructure. Bye-bye.